Well, the exact date of the historic meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky has become known. Why it's historic, I'll explain a bit later. This will take place on July 28 in Washington. Zelensky is flying with his team to meet Trump as the Americans promise to put several of their own plans for ending the war on the table. The main topic of the negotiations is strengthening Ukrainian air defense and licenses for the production of Patriot missiles. And here's what's significant. While Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, publicly lashes out at Donald Trump, accusing him of disrupting the Anchorage agreements and talking about a man's word, which we talked about in the previous episode. Meanwhile, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says that Moscow will wait for new proposals from the US. At this time, Trump is sharing a video of an interview with Volodymyr Zelensky on his social network, Truth Social. The interview was conducted by Loomer, the same MAGA blogger who not long ago called Ukrainians Nazis and wrote columns for Russia Today, but now has publicly stated, quote, "Russia is not our friend." In this interview, Zelensky admits that behind the scenes they have finally found common ground with Donald Trump, and that Trump has come to trust the Ukrainian president and acknowledge that it is Vladimir Putin who does not want to end the war. In this episode, we will go through everything in detail together, including when and what Zelensky and Trump will talk about. What happened to Laura Loomer that she is now our ally, and what did Zelensky tell her about the turning point in his relationship with Trump? And what did he say about the Soviet Union, which Russia could turn into again, and why does the Kremlin end up with nothing in this scenario? Well, I'll just briefly remind you here that Donald Trump promised to call Vladimir Putin on July 8, but he still hasn't called. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're moving towards 300,000 subscribers, so I would appreciate your subscription in particular. So, now we can say it officially. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, is going to Washington for an in-person meeting with Donald Trump and his team. And this time, the atmosphere of the visit is very different from the previous meetings between the two leaders. Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to the United States of America is scheduled for Tuesday, July 28. And now Reuters, citing a White House official, writes, US President Donald Trump. Donald Trump and the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, are planning to meet in Washington on Tuesday. A little later, Suspilna clarifies that in addition to talks with Trump, Zelensky will attend the memorial service for Senator Lindsey Graham, who died on July 11 at the age of 72 from complications of cardiovascular disease. At least that's the official version. Lindsey Graham's funeral will take place in Washington on the same day, July 28. And now Farsu. According to Ukrainian media, the details of the meeting are still being coordinated, since this is not just some protocol meeting between Zelensky and Trump. It's much more serious. The fact is that back on July 22, Zelensky had a phone conversation with Trump's special representatives, Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner. On the Ukrainian side, the head of the president's office, Kirilo Budanov, the first deputy head of the president's office, Serhiy Kislitsia, and the chief negotiator took part in that conversation. The negotiator from Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, who, by the way, will most likely move permanently to Washington and take up the post of Ukraine's ambassador to Washington. And the very next day after that conversation, on July 23, at a press conference, Zelensky announced the trip, and he said that the American side would share some ideas and plans for ending the war there in Washington, which are then planned to be discussed with the Russians as well. So, essentially, Stephen Witkoff officially invited Zelensky to Washington, while Putin has been sitting and waiting for a call from Donald Trump since July 8. And it's also important to note here that the Americans want to discuss future plans for ending the war with Ukraine first, and only then will all of this be discussed with the Russians. Looking ahead, today Peskov admitted that the Kremlin is waiting for this news, waiting to be told what Trump and Zelensky have decided. And in this context, it's also worth mentioning Marco Rubio's statement after his meeting with Sergei Lavrov in Manila, when Rubio said that all previous schemes and plans to end the war have not worked. They didn't work for one simple reason, he says, because Ukraine refused to surrender. Ukraine refused to accept any conditions that were unfavorable for itself, and all of the Kremlin's hopes that Trump would pressure Kiev and force Kiev to accept Putin's terms did not come true. And so, the key topics of negotiations between Ukraine and the US, besides discussing future peace plans, also include strengthening Ukraine's air defense and licensing the production of Patriot missiles. And right away, literally on the day the visit was announced, there was news that reinforces that point. Poland proposed that the United States establish joint production of missiles for Patriot systems with Ukraine and to place this production on Polish territory. Sure, you might say they're jumping on the bandwagon, but let's not. This was reported at a briefing by the deputy head of the Polish Ministry of Defense, Magdalena Sapkowiak-Czernecka. Her words were as follows, quote, "We suggested that this should be a trilateral cooperation, that is the US, Ukraine and also Poland, because this is about protecting this production so that it can be carried out in a safe location." Well, actually, the logic is clear and very beneficial for us. A factory producing Patriot interceptors on Polish territory is a facility under NATO protection where Russian missiles definitely won't reach, and the Russians won't dare to strike there. Let me remind you that Trump promised Ukraine the right to produce Patriot interceptors on July 8 during the public part of his meeting with Zelensky on the sidelines of the NATO summit in Ankara. Well, actually, Bloomberg warned at the time that launching such production would take a long time and wouldn't allow for quickly replenishing depleted stocks. But nevertheless, it's still a breakthrough, because as of today, besides the United States of America, of course, only Germany and Japan have such a license to produce Patriot interceptor missiles. That is, only 2 countries in the world. Ukraine became the 3rd. And in the context of Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to the United States of America, and in the context of what will be discussed there, it is worth mentioning the incredible shift of most of the MAGA movement towards Ukraine. A prominent representative of the MAGA movement, Laura Loomer, is currently in Kyiv. And Laura Loomer's story is important because it helps explain what's happening in Trump's camp. In the Trump camp, if you will. On July 23, Laura Loomer announced on the social network X that she had interviewed Volodymyr Zelensky at the Mariinsky Palace in Kyiv. Here is her quote. "I just interviewed President Volodymyr Zelensky at the Mariinsky Palace in Ukraine. There were no forbidden topics. I didn't hold back in my questions." And that's really true. She directly asked Zelensky if there are Nazis in Ukraine, and even asked some very strange questions. For example, whether it's true that Zelensky and Emmanuel Macron used drugs together, as Russian propaganda claimed. But nevertheless, yes, there were strange questions, but this interview was super important for Ukraine. I'll explain why. But first, let's talk about who Laura Loomer is and why it's really significant that she's now in Kyiv interviewing Zelensky. Laura Loomer is an ultra-right American blogger close to Donald Trump with a really huge audience. And for many years, she was the mouthpiece of American isolationists who said that America comes first and that the rest of the world doesn't really matter. Ah, right. She was the mouthpiece of those American isolationists who demanded an end to all support for Ukraine. She openly called Ukrainians Nazis. She criticized Zelensky and Ukrainian officials. She openly ran information campaigns against Ukrainian media. She spread Russian propaganda narratives. And starting from 2021, she wrote several columns for Russia Today, which means she was directly working for the Kremlin's propaganda channel. Let me give you one of her typical quotes from previous years. In this quote, you can basically understand Laura Loomer's whole attitude in those years. Quote, "We are not at war with Russia. When I see our politicians spitting on American taxpayers who are already struggling and sending $100 billion of our dollars to Ukraine, it makes me sick." This is what Laura Loomer was like before May of this year. But then Ukraine invited her editor to Kyiv and Odessa. He came to Kyiv and came under Russian shelling. Laura Loomer saw his real footage from Ukraine. And she suddenly saw the truth and said, how is this possible? So how is it that Russia, which she considered the defender of the Orthodox faith, is simply destroying entire cities with rockets, cities full of Christians just like in Russia but in Ukraine? She says, what's going on? Wait. We were told that there are Nazis in Ukraine, that they are against the faith, that these Nazis are in Ukraine. They kill priests there, they close churches, and Russia is going to defend the Orthodox faith. But it turns out that's not the case. These savages are just bombing Ukrainian cities, killing fellow Christians, and have no intention of stopping. Then she was shocked when the president of Ukraine congratulated the United States of America on Independence Day on July 4th. Meanwhile, Russia sent Medvedev to Iran to bid farewell to Khamenei, who is an enemy of the United States of America. In the end, she arrived in Kyiv herself to understand what was really happening. And from Kyiv, Laura Loomer publicly admitted that for years she had been under the influence of Russian propaganda. Her current statement is, Russia is not our friend. According to her, the trip to Ukraine helped her realize that some of the information she used to believe was a lie. And by the way, one of Laura Loomer's first stops in Kyiv was the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra, which was attacked by Russians who supposedly defend the Orthodox faith. And so in Kyiv, Loomer interviewed Zelensky. Well, and the most important thing for us in this whole story is that Donald Trump shared a fragment of this interview on his social network, Truth Social. Loomer herself wrote that the American president reacted very positively to her conversation. I should note here that Laura Loomer is a blogger who is very close to Donald Trump. They hug together, they've had a lot of joint events, and she's always somewhere nearby. And there is even information that she influenced some personnel decisions in the White House. But I'll be honest here, just so there aren't any overly high expectations. Laura Loomer's turnaround is not yet a change in the entire Trump administration's course, but when a person who for years broadcast Kremlin talking points to the MAGA audience publicly admits that he was deceived, well, that's a very noticeable shift in an environment that used to be the most hostile to us. So just imagine, the mouthpiece of the MAGA movement says, listen, I was wrong, I was deceived. I really hope that the MAGA movement will actually start to change. And most importantly, Laura Loomer is not alone in this regard. Another MAGA blogger, a blogger who previously supported Russia, has also suddenly changed their stance today. Podcaster Tim Pool stated that he now supports Ukraine's victory and admitted that Ukraine, quote, is fighting for its existence against an evil dictator. He also expressed hope that Trump will continue to help Kyiv, although previously he demanded that there be no aid to Ukraine at all. Just 2 years ago, this very Tim Pool called Ukraine, quote, the main enemy of the United States of America and demanded an end to military aid. And later it turned out that a company associated with him, awkward as it is, was receiving Russian money for spreading pro-Kremlin narratives within the United States of America. But overall, the trend of even the most notorious MAGA activists changing their stance actually works in our favor. Now let's talk about what exactly Zelensky said in that very interview with Laura Loomer. First of all, he talked about a turning point in his relationship with Donald Trump. According to him, the first such moment was the meeting at the Vatican, the one that took place at Pope Francis's funeral. Zelensky noted that during that very meeting, he and Trump were left alone, without even translators, advisors, or anyone else. And after that, their subsequent dialogue was positive. Secondly, and this is the main point he addressed specifically to the American audience, Zelensky explained why the war in Ukraine directly concerns the United States of America. Quote, I think that the Soviet Union is the most dangerous enemy for the United States. If Russia becomes the Soviet Union again, you will have China and the Soviet Union, the largest empire, the largest army in the world, and they will really be bigger and stronger than the United States. And that will be dangerous for you. That's the kind of argument that works with the MAGA audience. It's not about moral duty, not about democracy, but about American interests. They're isolationists, They're the ones shouting America first. Okay, okay. Here's the message. If you don't stop Russia now, Moscow and Beijing will form an alliance, making Beijing even stronger. Которая будет сильнее вас. And that's it. This is exactly the language Zelensky has been using with Trump these past few months. And this is the exact part of the interview that Trump posted on his social network. This is very important. And against this backdrop, the Kremlin is literally freaking out. The contrast is just striking. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, stated today, July 24, that Russia will wait for new proposals from the US regarding the resolution of the war. Propagandist Zarabin said, what about us? Russia! Russia! And are we going to wait while Trump and Zelensky come up with some new formats? If the spirit of Anchorage has failed, what about us? Are we just going to sit and wait? We're Russia. We shouldn't do that. And then Peskov suddenly replied to this, quote, "We will wait for new proposals. We will..." Of course, they have to be acceptable to us first and foremost. At the same time, he repeated about the Kremlin's failure in Anchorage. Then there's another quote. President Trump is sincere, and his negotiators are sincere in their desire to really come up with some options that are acceptable to everyone. The option that was proposed by them was accepted by us, but not by the Ukrainians. They couldn't break the Ukrainians, who were encouraged by the Europeans. You know, I think this can actually be taken as a compliment. Even coming from someone as rotten as Peskov, it can be seen as a compliment. Even Trump couldn't, as Peskov put it, break the Ukrainians. And Peskov also let slip something that I think is worth remembering. According to him, there is duality in the Trump administration's position, and Moscow intends to take advantage of it. Quote, "We should use this kind of duality in the Trump administration's position in those areas where it matches our interests. And their desire to promote a peaceful settlement absolutely matches our interests." So, in other words, the Kremlin openly admits that it intends to play on the contradictions within the American administration. To wait, to demand conditions that are acceptable to them, and to count on the fact that, well, sooner or later, Washington will give in and sell out. At the same time, today, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, let me remind you, accused Trump of disrupting the Ankara agreements and stated that Russia acted on the principle, quote, "A man's word is his bond." But the US did not keep its promise to pressure Ukraine. So basically, Lavrov said that Trump is not a man of his word and doesn't keep his promises. Well, I don't know if Americans understand that. This kind of crude Russian language, I don't think they really understand it because it's purely Russian culture. This whole thing with thugs, street punks, gangsters, back alley talk, where being a real man and keeping your word matters, all these lowlifes. I'm not sure of the right word, but overall I think Lavrov got a bit carried away. When he leaves Russia, he should understand that he's entering the civilized world. It's not his rough country anymore. People there speak a completely different language. I mean, not linguistically, but culturally, it's a different language. They don't understand things like a man's word is his bond. There, they have diplomacy, treaties, agreements that are signed, legally formalized, and ratified. That's the international language, not this a man's word is his bond thing. Only Russian lowlifes speak that way, and that's it. And no one else in the world speaks that way. And if you show your face in the civilized world, you have to accept the rules of the civilized world. You need to wash up and dress nicely. Don't put Lavrov's horse face on display, but put forward a decent person. If you have even one such person among you, that's who should be talking to the world, not the way you're trying to do it now. But then again, what is there to be surprised about? Sorry for being so moralistic, but what is there to be surprised about when Russian tourists, I remember, they would go somewhere like Turkey or Egypt and say, "I'm only going to speak Russian." Idiot, nobody understands you. Well, go on, keep talking. Well, if you've gone out into the civilized world, you have to accept the rules of the game. But here, sorry, I digressed a bit. Let's continue. As for the pressure on Putin, the US is using two tools at once here. The first is the sanctions bill by the late Senator Lindsey Graham, and its main measure, as you remember, is tariffs of up to 100% against the largest buyers of Russian oil. And according to the New York Times, Trump said he would approve the bill if he is given the right to decide the fate of these sanctions himself. He also said that the document could be expanded. There are also sanctions against Iran included, and it could be adopted by August. And it's also telling that Zelensky's visit coincides exactly with the decisive moment for this bill. The second tool is our own, a Ukrainian one. Trump previously publicly admitted that strikes on Russian oil refineries could help end the war. He says this escalation could actually bring peace closer. So, basically, the American president is approving what we're doing. Every night we burn down their oil refineries, Wildberries warehouses, and military factories. So, our so-called long-range sanctions are working faster than any sanction bills in the US. And now Zelensky says that Ukraine is developing drones with a range of up to 10,000 kilometers to burn down all of Russia. And at this point, I'm sure Russians will laugh, saying, "Come on, 10,000 kilometers, what are you talking about?" And let me remind you, the wild Russians laughed until Ukrainian drones started burning down their factories 3,000 kilometers away. And I don't see such loud laughter anymore when Wildberries warehouses are burning all over Russia. It's not funny anymore. Now, about why the negotiations between Zelensky and Trump are also being linked to the European framework. Today, a column by Samuel Charap from RAND Corporation was published in the Financial Times, in which he writes, "The war has reached a point where it's time to start real negotiations." His key thesis is as follows. Ukraine is currently in a strong position, and this needs to be used at the negotiating table. According to Karop, Russia has felt Ukraine's strength and may show more flexibility in real negotiations. In summary, on July 28, Zelensky is flying to Washington to meet with Donald Trump. This is already a fact. On the table are American plans to end the war, strengthen our air defense, and licenses for Patriot systems, whose production Poland is already asking to host, offering its territory as a safe site. At this time, the Kremlin is behaving like an offended party. Sergei Lavrov publicly reproaches Trump for not keeping his promises. Peskov is waiting for proposals, and openly says that he intends to play on the contradictions within the Trump administration. Well, in the meantime, Trump's trust is shifting in our direction. So much so that he is reposting an interview with Zelensky by his own MAGA blogger who, I remind you, was writing columns for Russia Today just yesterday and today says that Russia is not a friend to America. Meanwhile, Putin, I remind you, has been waiting since July 8th for Donald Trump's promised phone call. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.